Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first Crone Law Firm Facebook Live show. I'm Alan Crone. I'm the Crone of Crone Law Firm, and we're an employment law firm in Memphis, Tennessee. And we represent employees, executives, and entrepreneurs in any dispute they have which affects their ability to make money. And that could be everything from compensation issues to wrongful termination, discrimination, non-competes, buy-sell agreements, all sorts of things, even personal injury cases that result in someone losing their capacity to make a living. And that's our mission here, is we try to help folks with probably one of the most important relationships in their lives, and that's their relationship with their employer, whether they're self-employed or have business partners, or they're just working folks who work for a living and get a W-2 at the end of the year. So we've been frequently asked questions about different kinds of laws, employment laws, and we thought it would be a good idea to start a weekly or bi-weekly chat like this, where we take some of your questions that have come in and answer them live on Facebook, and hopefully people will get something out of this, and it'll be helpful to some folks. And if it's helpful to just one or two folks, then I don't think this is a waste of time. Again, my name is Alan Crone, and you can reach me here at the Crone Law Firm, 901-737-7740. So we're going to talk about overtime compensation. And overtime compensation basically is special added compensation that a worker gets when they work more than 40 hours in a given work week. So the first question I have is, when does an employer have to pay overtime? That's a great question. And the answer is, an employer has to pay overtime to certain kinds of workers anytime they work more than 40 hours in any given work week. And it's important to stop right there, because a lot of people don't understand exactly when overtime cuts in. Some people think it's more than 8 hours a day. Some people think it's more than 80 hours in a 2-week pay period. And frankly, the way some companies pay their workers add to this confusion, because it's hard to read their pay stubs so that you don't know exactly what you're getting paid for. But each week, you analyze each week separately. And an employer can decide when their work week begins and when it ends. And some employers make that decision that it's Monday through Sunday, and they leave it that way for 100 years. Some employers change it frequently, and they can do that, but they can't change it to try to avoid paying overtime. So you look at each week and you say, did I work more than 40 hours in a given work week? And if the answer is yes, then you are owed time and a half for every hour over 40 that you worked. And the way you decide what time and a half is you take your regular rate. And we could do a whole show just on the regular rate, and we may do that in the future. But basically, your regular rate is what is your normal rate of pay. If you're paid by the hour, say $10 an hour, then that's an easy calculus. You just take your regular rate of $10 an hour and you multiply it by 1.5, which would give you an overtime rate of $15 an hour. Sometimes companies pay you additional compensation, maybe a shift differential if you're a nurse, or a bonus or commission, and all of that extra money is supposed to be calculated into your regular rate. So even though your base rate may be $10 an hour, it may be that because of these add-ons, your regular rate should be calculated more like 15 or 20. And that's on a case-by-case basis, and we have to look into that in every case to determine what the regular rate is. And then you multiply that by time and a half. For example, if your employer requires you to work 45 hours in a given week, but only pays you your regular rate, then you don't multiply it by 1.5, you multiply it just by 0.5, because you've already been paid that straight time. So each case is different, and each calculation is a little bit different. Now, this all presupposes that the worker in question is entitled to be paid overtime. And the way the law breaks that down, and right now we're talking about the federal law because some state laws are different. For example, where I am in Tennessee, there really isn't a state corollary to the federal law. In California and New York and some other states, they have their own overtime laws which pay you a little bit better than the federal law. So you've got essentially two claims, one state and one federal. But we're going to be talking about the federal law since that applies to everybody. And so under the federal law, you have to determine whether or not the person is entitled to overtime, and they call that either being exempt from overtime or not exempt or non-exempt from overtime. And I'll be honest with you, when I first started doing this, I always kind of had to catch myself because that's not the easiest thing to say. You have to think, okay, exempt means this. And so if you're exempt, that means you don't get overtime. If you're non-exempt, that means you're entitled to overtime. So that brings me to our second question, which is what kinds of jobs are exempted from overtime? And again, there are a number of statutes and regulations under the federal law that decide this. And it's interesting when the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is where we get our minimum wage and our overtime laws, when that was enacted, was back in the 30s during the Depression. And the American workplace looks a lot different than it does now. And so a lot of these exemptions were done at the time and reflect a different kind of method of work. So when you try to apply some of these rules to modern workplace, that's where there's a lot of gray area, and that's where a lot of people fall through the cracks. So just because your company tells you that you're not entitled to overtime, if you're working a lot of hours and you feel like you're not being paid appropriately, you should contact someone like me to look at your situation and see if you are in fact exempt from overtime, because very, very often I find that workers are working and not being paid appropriately. There's some big exemptions to overtime. For example, learned professionals like doctors and lawyers and nurses and accountants and those kinds of folks can be exempted from overtime if they are performing their profession with a lot of independent judgment, and they are paid a salary of at least $455 a week, a guaranteed salary. I find frequently that some of these professionals that I just listed, for example, nurses, are often paid by the hour. And even though they would qualify for the learned exemption based on their duties and their background, they're not entitled to it. They're not entitled for the company to take it based on the fact that they're only paid by the hour. Then there's the executive exemption, and these are people that have a lot of responsibility for a defined subdivision of a business where they're supervising and directing more than 2 employees. And the issue there comes whether or not they actually are in charge, or if they can exercise their own discretion, or if they're really just taking orders from someone else. A good example might be, a particular worker might be called the office manager or the store manager or some sort of manager. But their district manager is really running the store. And every time there's a decision that has to be made, the manager has to go to the district manager for a decision. That person might not be exempt from overtime and may be entitled to overtime compensation. There's also the administrative exemption, and that's a more complicated exemption. But basically, you have, in all of these that I'm talking about now, you have to be paid a salary. If you're paid an hourly rate, then you are entitled to overtime. But if you're paid a salary of more than $455 a week, and you exercise a lot of independent judgment while working in an office, performing a duty that's not part of the product offering of the company, then you may be entitled to overtime compensation. I know that's a lot of elements, but basically you have to be, an example I always give is you might have a bookkeeper who's working in an office. And if the company is in the business of not providing bookkeeping services, then that person may qualify for the exemption if that person exercises a lot of independent judgment. And that's really what it comes down to for a lot of these exemptions, particularly the executive exemption and the administrative exemption, is the person really exercising a lot of independent judgment? And when I'm talking to folks, that's some of the first things that we talk about in our consultation is that fact. And oftentimes folks tell me, yeah, that may be what my title is, or that may be what my job description says, but that's not what I do. I got to run everything past some other person who's higher up in the organizational chart, who's actually running things. Another exemption would be the computer exemption. And several years ago, particularly, a lot of companies thought as long as you were working on a computer, you were entitled to this exemption. But basically, this refers to people who are working in coding and software development. It's a very high end of computer programming. If the worker is applying applications, troubleshooting, working a consumer help desk, that sort of thing, then they're probably entitled to overtime. And that's something that you should consult with an attorney about. And there are a number of other exemptions. And one thing that is important to remember is that when the statute was passed, it was passed in Congress. And so it was a compromise. And a lot of different interest groups got exemptions. There's some farming exemptions. And if you work at a car dealership, you may be exempt just by virtue of working at a car dealership. If you drive a truck or involved in the trucking industry, there may be some exemptions. But all of those, just because you work at a car dealership or for a trucking company or on a farm, doesn't necessarily mean that they are entitled not to pay you overtime. If you think you're working a lot of hours and you're not being fairly compensated, to me, that's the test. You ought to at least look into it and ask a lawyer. And a lawyer can tell you whether or not it's a clear case or a close case one way or the other. And then you'll know for sure what your rights are, and you can pursue it that way. One question that I'm frequently asked that I think is an excellent question is, can you get paid overtime if you're paid a salary? People will call me up and say, Alan, my employer says that because I'm paid a salary, I'm not entitled to overtime. Well, that is not the case. Salary is a test, and it's called the salary basis test. And if you Google that and you read it without a real good understanding of the overtime laws, you might think that. And your employer might legitimately think that because his accountant or some business associate or somebody told him that, and that's what they're going on. Well, just being paid a salary is not where you stop your analysis. You have to then go on and say, okay, is there an exemption that where my duties, what I actually do, not what my job description says I do, but what I actually do, does that qualify me for the exemption? And so that's a myth that I always take every opportunity to bust, because a lot of people think, well, if I'm just paid a salary, then I don't have to, then I'm not entitled to overtime. It's an important consideration, but that's not where the analysis needs to stop. Can an employee agree not to be paid overtime? There's a very surprising answer to this question. The answer is no. I don't care if you've signed an agreement that says, this is the way I'm going to get paid, and I know I'm entitled to overtime, but I'm not going to get paid overtime, and I agree not to take it. The company can't rely on that. The law was written to make sure that people got paid when they worked more than 40 hours a week, and it was written in such a way that they couldn't agree to that. In fact, the only way that a company can get a release from an overtime case is for a court or the Department of Labor to approve that settlement. So if you've agreed to something and you find out later that it's illegal, the company can't use that against you. Now, they may try. I've had cases where the company says, well, look, we agreed to this, and he understood or she understood the way she was going to get paid, and they agreed to that. And that's not good enough. The company has to pay you in a legal way. It has to pay you everything that they owe you, regardless of whether or not you made that agreement with them. So again, the test I always give people is if you believe that you work too many hours and are not getting paid fairly, then you need to look into it. Particularly if you're working more than 40 hours in a given work week and you're not being paid any more after that 40th hour. And there are different ways that those damages are calculated, but you should go and have it checked out, because this isn't just about getting money. This isn't about getting something for nothing. These workers work for this money. They earned it. They're legally entitled to it. And I believe that all businesses should be on an even playing field. And if you've got a business out there that's cheating its workers, not only is that business cheating the worker, it's also competing unfairly against the other businesses in its industry. And so it's up to us to make sure we assert ourselves and get paid what we're owed. And it really is neither more nor less of that. And finally, can I sue my employer for unpaid overtime? And you can. And there are a couple of different ways to go about it. One is you can come see a lawyer like me. And if you think you have an overtime claim, be happy to talk with you. My number is 901-737-7740. That's 901-737-7740. I'm also on the web at CroneLawFirmPLC.com. If you Google my name, just say Alan Crone, C-R-O-N-E, attorney Memphis. I guarantee you my name's going to pop up at least once on that first page. So you'll be able to find me without any problem. And so that's one way to go about it, is to go see a private attorney, and they can help you determine if you have a case. If you call us, we'll interview you, and we'll find out exactly what your job duties are, what your situation is, whether or not it's worth your while to file a claim. Obviously, if you work overtime once for 1 hour, once or twice a month, that claim may not be worth your while to assert. But if you're working 10 or 12 hours a week overtime and not getting paid for it, that certainly is worth your while potentially to bring. Another way is to go see the Department of Labor. Locally, there are many offices in every state of the Department of Labor, and you can file a report, and they may investigate it, or they may not investigate it. I can say the Department of Labor is very busy, and sometimes they have a lot of capacity and can jump right on your case, but most of the time, the Department of Labor, is looking for big employers with lots of employees so that they can get a bigger bang for their buck. And they're also looking for sometimes specific kinds of cases. And sometimes they have a long wait before they can investigate your situation. They're also conducting spot audits themselves without regard to being contacted by private parties. But either way can work. And what you're entitled to, if you're successful in a case like this, is you're entitled to receive the unpaid compensation. So in other words, you take the number of hours you worked by your regular rate, the appropriate multiplier, and you multiply that all out, and that's how much your lost wages claims are. If it's a willful violation, then you can get twice that amount, but that's only if it's a willful violation. And then the company pays your attorney's fees and costs of bringing the lawsuit. And it's not designed, to get a big jury verdict out of on a particular case, but it is designed to pay you what you're owed, a little bit extra, hopefully, for your trouble, and to make sure that you don't have to come out of pocket to pay your attorney. So I hope this has been helpful. This has been our inaugural Facebook Live show. I've enjoyed recording it. I hope that if you've listened to it, that you've enjoyed it, you've got something out of it. And if I can answer any questions for you, again, Google me at Alan Crone, Memphis attorney, or you can call my office at 901-737-7740. And I hope you have a nice evening. And thank you very much for listening.